At 0156 hours on the 4th of February, 2026, in the deepest operating zone of the Persian Gulf 45 nautical miles off Bandar Abbas, the Combat Information Center of USS Abraham Lincoln CVN-72 was in subdued chaos. Something was picked by the AN/SPY-1D radar array which caused the tactical action officer to run cold. 8C skimming contacts with the water at Mach 2.84 meters in the air and 047 degrees. This was exactly the signature that the Pentagon had been war-gaming a millennium ago. Iranian Khalif-Faz anti-ship ballistic missiles, the so-called carrier killers, which the Pentagon had never encountered in real life, only in war games. But that was not the actual danger. Even as the coordinator of submarine warfare screamed into his headset, passive sonar heard the undoubted sound of compressed air being thrown out of torpedo tubes, not of one conception, but of three directions, at once. 3 Iranian Ghadar-type mini-submarines had already entered the inner defensive ring of the carrier strike group and were at a depth of 85 meters, in an ideal triangle formation around the $13 billion supercarrier. The carrier air wing was on deck, mid-refueling. 18 A-18 Super Hornets were helpless, still on the deck with their fuel lines still attached, and each one of the aircrafts packed 8,000 pounds of JP-5 jet fuel that would convert the deck to a crematorium in the event just one missile fragment hits the hull. The Abraham Lincoln, which had been displacing 97,000 tons, and was now being home to 5,200 people, had precisely 73 seconds before the missiles went into terminal range and the torpedoes into minimum arming range. Communicado wake turbulence would cause the carrier to cut the fuel lines should the carrier make any effort to evade it, striking an inferno that can be controlled, in case the flanking Aegis cruisers fired on the carrier using their SM-6 interceptors. The radar signal would provide the Iranian submarines the perfect firing solution to their wire-guided torpedoes. Had the carrier swung sharply to starboard to open up its defenses, it would leave her unarmored belly to the submarine in that very quadrant. 5,200 human beings were on the line. A strike group commander, Rear Admiral Marcus Chen, was about to give an order that would have contravened all the rules in the Naval Warfare Manual of a defensive maneuver. A move that would convert the most potent weapon America possessed in its possession to a trap that would have been more disastrous than anything Iran intended to do. Go back to 0143 hours when the U.S. Navy was still under the impression that these waters belonged to the U.S. Navy. The Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group was carrying out Operation Sentinel Guard, which was an exercise to exercise freedom of navigation and send an emphatic message following an announcement by the Iran of a 50-mile exclusion zone around its coastline on the 1st of February. The line was textbook perfect. The supercarrier was in the middle and was covered by the Aegis cruiser USS Lake Champlain on the port, the destroyer USS Howard on the starboard, and the attack submarine USS Annapolis prowling the bottom at 200 meters depth. The E-2D Hawkeye early warning airplane flying around at 25,000 feet had a clear sky, normal merchant traffic, and none of hostile intent. That was the masterpiece of deception of Iran. They had intentionally put a high number of civilian fishing vessels into the waters over 11 days, flooding the radar displays with hundreds of harmless targets until the threat algorithms of the Aegis combat system taught themselves to disregard them. What the American intelligence failed to understand was that 40% of those fishing boats were fast attack craft of the Revolutionary Guard boats painted with wooden superstructures and altered radar cross-sections. They had been plotting the patrol routes of the carrier group, recording shift overlaps, recording electronic emissions, and computing the exact period of 14 minutes in which the carrier would be most susceptible in the process of flight deck refueling. The trap was set off at 0152 hours. The Iranian Naval Operations Command in Tehran made one encrypted burst transmission on the X-band frequency. At the same moment, 3 modified Hendajan-class landing vessels which had been lying idle with the fishing fleet 6 days had their disguised cargo doors flung violently open. Off each of the vessels a hydraulic launch rail was raised to a height of 75 degrees, and in 8 seconds 8 Khalif-Faz missiles had burst into solid fuel boosters. The missiles were not taking a standard ballistic trajectory. They instead followed a flat hypersonic skip-glide profile with a low 20 meters altitude, intended to take advantage of the radar horizon and to reduce the reaction time of the Aegis system. At the same time, underwater hell was opened. The 3 Ghadar-type submarines that had been resting motionless on the sea bottom 72 hours in the off position of their motors to reduce acoustic presence fired up their ultra-quiet air-independent propulsion systems. These midget submarines, weighing 120 tons, were designed particularly to operate in the shallow water of the Persian Gulf, and they were surfacing without making any sound on a layer of thermocline, which scattered active sonar returns. They had an anechoic coating that was reverse-engineered after captured Russian technology that reflected 87% of the incoming sonar pulses. The towed array sonar of the USS Annapolis AN SQQ-89 had passed past them 17 times without a single solid return. The commanders of the Iranian submarines did not start at once. Then they waited, patiently and disciplined, till the surface missiles had passed the 40-kilometer threshold and the Aegis defense response had been given. The SPY-1D radar of the USS Lake Champlain, just as expected, switched to full-power active mode, and the missiles in flight were visible. But at the same time they had broadcasted the precise position of the carrier group to all the passive sensors within the 200 kilometers range. As soon as the initial SM-6 missile shot out of the vertical launch cell, the Ghadar submarines opened the torpedo tubes and the outer doors. At the multi-layered nightmare on the tactical display, Admiral Chen gazed on the Lincoln Bridge. The incoming missiles were going to hit in 68 seconds. Normal defensive practice required the full strike force to perform a combined countermeasured maneuver known as Spread Delta IV when the Aegis cruisers were involved in layered missile defense. However, a report of a disastrous nature had just come through the flight deck chief. The refueling operation could not be called in good time. The fuel lines adopted a novel quick disconnect system which failed safety certification in 3 of 5 tests. But the Navy had to use it due to budget cuts. In a normal state, it required 90 seconds to disconnect. During combat conditions when deck hands were scrambling, it could take at least 3 minutes. The carrier did not have the capability of maneuvering without killing its own aircrews. Yet that was but the superficialness of the death trap. The coordinator of the submarine warfare was reporting the torpedo launch sequence of all 3 Ghadar submarines. These were the Valfajr torpedoes, an Iranian modification of the Chinese U-4 model, capable of 45 knots, with a depth of 60 meters. Time to impact, 95 seconds. The USS Annapolis would be able to deal with Mark 48 torpedoes. The counter battery would cause a sonar whiteout, temporarily disabling the acoustic defenses of the carrier group at least 4 minutes. Sufficient time to allow Iranian reinforcements to reach the carrier group. The nightmare was multiplied by even greater factors when the ESM operator noticed active radar emissions which belonged to Iranian shore defenses sites Ghadar. The signature of the radar was the targeting system of the Noor anti-ship missile, reverse-engineered Chinese C-802, having a 200-kilogram warhead with the range of 120 kilometers. The Iranian tact was now quite plain. Khalifa's ballistic missiles and submarine torpedoes were not to sink the carrier. They were supposed to make the carrier group radiate active radar and give out a false position to allow the shore-based missile batteries to send the killing blow. Admiral Chen was in the situation of no-win. Protect against the missiles and leave the group vulnerable to the attack of submarines. Defend against the submarines and develop acoustic blindness. Remain MCON silent and allow the first wave to strike unopposed. Any normal battle strategy resulted in disastrous losses. Now, let's make a prediction. However, when you believe that Admiral Chen can break through this trap of many layers and lose not a single ship, write 1 in the comments. In case you think that American casualties are unavoidable and this would result in a shooting war, type 2. Drop your answer now. This is what really occurred during those desperate 68 seconds. Admiral Chen did not issue the order to either defend or evade. Rather, he picked up the red handset to the submarine direct line and issued an order, which made every officer in the CIC believe that he had lost his sanity. Annapolis, come shallow to 30 meters. Turn on all active sonar systems to maximum power and send continuous random noise on all frequencies. Make us completely deaf. The captain of the USS Annapolis took 2 seconds to execute the order. The Los Angeles-type attack submarine shot to the surface with alarming rapidity, contravening all the principles of submarine warfare, and turned on its AN/BQQ-10 sonar system in what it called brute force omnidirectional ping. The energy emitted by the sound was so high such that it could burst the eardrums of careless divers at 500 meters. This was not intended to find enemies, but rather to provide an acoustic wall of noise that would overwhelm all the hydrophones within a 10-kilometer radius. The impact was immediate. The 3 Iranian Ghadar submarines, all strategic worth of which was based on their capability to listen to the carrier force and have accurate firing solutions to their wire-guided torpedoes, were abruptly working in acoustic silence. Their sonar operators could not hear the guidance wires or get updated targeting information because of the constant noises. Being now autonomous, and not guided by any updates, the Valfager torpedoes entered their emergency navigation, active acoustic homing on the loudest target. And at that time the noisiest target in the Persian Gulf was not the carrier. It was the USS Annapolis itself, intentionally playing noisemaker like a neon sign saying "shoot me." At the same time, Admiral Chen gave the maneuver which would save the strike group or destroy it. All stop. Emergency deballasting. Turn Prairie Massacre to the fullest. Drop all Nixie decays we have. One of the floating cities, the Abraham Lincoln, weighing 97,000 tons, performed an emergency engine shutdown. Minimal nuclear reactors were turned on in the 4A-1B reactors. The huge propellers ceased to agitate the water. The Prairie Massacre system that created a curtain effect by causing air bubbles to surround the hull in order to conceal acoustic signature came to life at 300% of normal capacity. The acoustic signature of the carrier dropped on the tactical display as a roaring giant to nearly nothing in 12 seconds. The boat turned into a hole into the water. A ghost. However, the incoming missiles were 40 seconds away and the Aegis cruisers had not yet fired a single interceptor. That was deliberate. Chen had ordered them to keep fire until the very last possible moment, which enabled the missiles to approach to 18 kilometers. In that range, the terminal guidance radars of the missiles would come on the hunt of the huge radar reflection of an aircraft carrier. The carrier was not radiating anything. All radars, all transmitters, all electronic systems which could be detected were brought down. The Abraham Lincoln had gone out of commission electronically. The seeking heads of the Khalifa's missiles, which were programmed to seek the massive cross-section of a carrier radar, detected nothing. Their algorithms were initiated searching, scanning a 30-degree cone. The backup targeting protocol was a go. Infrared homing of the heat signature of the nuclear reactors and jet engines of the carrier. It was then that the USS Lake Champlain played its role in the hopeless game of Admiral Chen. The cruiser had discharged all its Mark 36 SRBOC chaff and flare dispensers at once, resulting in a thermal cloud so high that it showed up as a huge heat source on the infrared sensors. A radar return 60% the size of a carrier was created by the chaff cloud. In the air at the exact altitude the carrier's superstructure of the island would be. It was near enough to the guidance systems in the missiles. The Khalifa's missiles diverted on the non-existent target, 6 of them in the 8 missiles hitting the chaff cloud. The USS Lake Champlain did not open fire until the missiles were fired. The control surfaces angled up at the decoy, and then its actual defense salvo was fired. 8 SM-6 missiles fired in ripple fire mode and their active radar seekers instantly gained the incoming threats. The interaction occurred in an altitude of 200 meters with a separation of 4 kilometers with the cruiser. With 6 consecutive explosions the sky threw up the interceptors as they hit their mark, plunging shrapnel and flaming rocket fuel into the Gulf. But 2 missiles had turned off the decoy. Their superior AI-assisted guidance algorithms identified the chaff pattern and they kept searching. The actual carrier was discovered by them, but had only 22 seconds to go. The USS Howard, which was on the starboard side, had been awaiting such a situation. The AN/SLQ-32 V3 electronic warfare system had also been passively monitoring radar emissions of the missiles, computing course and point of impact. As soon as the 2 missiles were launched toward the carrier, the Howard sent its Surface Electronic Warfare Improvement Program (SEWIP) jammers to their full power in a bid to send false range and velocity information directly into the missile seeker heads. The impact was so delicate yet disastrous. The onboard computers on the missiles determined that the carrier was in reality 800 meters further on and traveling at 35 knots rather than 0 knots. Their guidance systems ordered a minor deviation of their paths with the intended destination being where they thought the carrier would be after 22 seconds. They missed. Both missiles missed the stationary carrier by 600 meters, hitting the water and detonating with geysers of white water that soaked the flight deck and had no casualties. But the torpedo problem did not get solved. The 3 Valfager who were running on active homing on acoustic homing were heading towards the USS Annapolis, who was intentionally turning into the loudest target in the Gulf. The submarine attack was about to have precisely one opportunity to make it through the next. The Annapolis captain synchronized the launch of 3 Mark 48 ADCAP torpedoes, though not against the Iranian submersives. He fired them at 3 bearing, without any threat. and ordered every torpedo to run at the fullest speed in a spiral search effect with active sonar pulses. The impact generated 3 new acoustic sources which were moving unpredictably at a speed of 55 knots. The directing systems of the Iranian Valfajr torpedoes, flooded with 4 distinct loud targets all moving at varying targets, started to display the deadly flaw of acoustically homing weapons confusing the targets. 2 of the torpedoes started pursuing the Mark 48 decoys, as they were unable to stay on a firm lock. The 3rd torpedo, which was aimed at the Annapolis as such, remained dedicated. The Annapolis made a move known as knuckle and sprint at a range of 800 meters. The submarine ejected a huge bubble cloud through its emergency ballast blow system and formed an acoustic wall, then accelerated to flank speed, and plunged at 35-degree down angle. The bubble cloud was plowed through by the Iranian torpedo, whose speed was 45 knot, and this lost its target. Its searcher head set off in search and every second was precious as its fuel burnt off. Before it regained contact, the Annapolis had cleared the range to 1,200 meters and was gaining ground at 33 knots. The torpedo had lost its fuel 200 meters before hitting its destination and sunk to the bottom harmlessly. But the battle wasn't over. The ground-based NOR missile launchers had been informed at last by their coastal radar posts of the position of their target, the electronic warfare emissions of the USS Howard. There were 4 NOR missiles fired on hidden locations in the mountains, which were flying at the Mach 09 strike group. The appearance of the new threat at the display screen was the call made by Admiral Chen that would mark his career. He had the Abraham Lincoln rev the dead stop up to the flank speed in a single inhuman acceleration. The nuclear reactors were turned to 104% power. The huge screws tore into the water and the carrier began to swing on. The fuel lines of the F/A-18s that were joined together even though the battle was raging around the 2 lines pulled against their couplings. 3 lines broke and the JP-5 flew about the deck. The chief of the flight deck made a choice which saved 5,200 lives. Rather than attempting to prevent the spray of the fuel, he ordered the highest discharge of the AFFF, aqueous film forming foam, system to be activated. The whole flight deck was covered with 3 feet of fire suppression foam below the rim of 4 seconds. The fuel spray was just smothered off and the fire threat was eliminated. The sudden acceleration of the carrier had a second impact which Chen had estimated. The huge turbulence of the wake formed a foaming swell of white water stretched 400 meters behind the vessel. The NOR missiles, which were in terminal phase, had radar altimeters, which were keeping the missiles at 5 meters at sea level. False altitude returns with the turbulent wake, and the flight computers on the missiles are fooled by thinking that they are ascending when they are actually level flying. 2 missiles flew straight to the wake turbulence where they landed in the water. The other 2 had adjusted the altitude and had gone up to 15 meters to clear the disturbance. Their change of altitude was death sentence. They fired at 15 meters into the engagement envelope of the close-in weapon systems, CIWS, that it had installed on itself. 2 phalanx guns turned to face the incoming fire and began firing with the typical buzz-saw sound with 20mm rounds of tungsten penetrators 4,500 rounds per minute. Both the missiles were torn 800 meters away off the ship. The USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group survived 8 anti-ship ballistic missiles, 3 submarine-fired torpedoes and 4 land-based cruise missiles in the course of 73 seconds of the hottest naval battle since World War II, and not a single casualty in the group. Admiral Chen was not celebrating. His focus was on the intelligence feed of the NSA liaison officer. Out of Bandar Abbas harbor, Iranian Revolutionary Guard boats were pouring. NOR missiles 12 Pakan-class missile boats, with 4 missiles per boat. Time to launch position, 18 minutes. The admiral had won the preliminary, but Iran was going into a second round with 3 times the number of forces. The Abraham Lincoln battle group attained full combat alert. All the vertical launch cells were equipped. All the aircraft on deck were crash-fueled and armed desperately. This striker group commander gave the order of a fighting withdrawal back to open water, which was maintained at 28 kn/sec with all weapon systems hot and ready. Supreme National Security Council held an emergency meeting in Tehran. The unsuccessful raid had demonstrated their methods, but it had also brought something good in it. The US Navy had shown them the entire range of their electronic warfighting capabilities, their defensive measures, and how far they were ready to go. The Iranian military intelligence was already interpreting the data of the engagement, preparing the countermeasures of the further conflict. The Crisis Action Team at Pentagon had a bleak scenario in Washington, combined with brilliant improvisation. technological superiority and calculated risk-taking that bordered on recklessness. The US Navy had survived. However, the wisdom test was obvious that Iran had not made it an all-out attack but a test. They were poking holes, collecting intelligence, sharpening the strategy. At 0341 hours, the Abraham Lincoln strike group entered safe waters off Iranian territorial waters and was 45 nautical miles to the south. The strategic charts indicated clear areas at last in every direction. However, at the Combat Information Center, all the officers were aware of the truth. They had succeeded in the battle and revealed their playbook. Iran had learned that US carriers would lose electronic emissions discipline in order to resist missiles. That American submarines would intentionally seek to be fired at in order to defend the strike group. That Aegis system could be induced to untimely action by multi-axis actions. The face-off in the Persian Gulf on the 6th of the second month of 2026 had seen no single shot of the offensive weaponry in the carrier. The political calculation was obvious. Dropping tomahawks upon the Iranian soil would have precipitated the war in the region that no one desired. But the message had been sent. Iran showed them they could intimidate the most powerful military asset of America in 70 years of US Navy supremacy in the waters. America showed that they are capable of resisting those threats, but at the expense of letting go of their most secretive defensive technologies. The biggest question was not answered yet. When Iran incorporates these lessons into their next attack, and what will they do when they combine the ballistic missiles with the submarines and swarm boats in one well-organized attack that they would know to counter any defense that the US Navy has just shown them? The Abraham Lincoln was heading to the Arabian Sea, and her crew, though tired and still alive, made it in the black waters of the Persian Gulf. Behind them were already disappearing the most powerful submarines of Iran, in new positions, ready to begin the next game. With thousands of lives as a stake and the balance of power in the most strategic water of the world,